And now for the broader stories for today. Now first up, the CCP is making a new push for logistics systems to stabilize China's supply chains, with planned projects including the construction of hundreds of new airports. Yet behind this move is something deeper, and it may give us another hint at the true state of the Chinese economy. On September 9th, CCP leader Xi Jinping spoke at the 8th meeting of the Central Committee of Financial and Economic Affairs and said, according to the state-run news agency Xinhua, that building these systems should be treated as a critical strategic mission. She also said that this would be indispensable to the regime's push in development. Now, in more practical terms, Xi is claiming the construction of new infrastructure projects such as high-speed rail lines, airports, warehouses, so on. He's saying these are an essential focus. And already the CCP appears to be moving forward with this. Now, looking just at airports, in 2019 there were an estimated 235 airports in China. And CCP officials believe this will grow to around 450 airports over the next 15 years. South China Morning Post reported in March that the CCP was on an apparent, quote, binge of constructing airports, but noted this is despite signs that air traffic is slowing, not growing. So again, why are they building airports and doing this big infrastructure push if it's slowing down, not growing? This is not meant to, say, take pressure off of growth. As far as the plans go, much of this will be built in the Yangtze River Delta region, the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, and the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area, as well as Chongqing City and Chengdu City. But if the growth isn't there to justify all this new construction, then what's the purpose? Well, this ties into one of the CCP's major fallback economic programs, pouring funds into technically useless construction projects in order to artificially stimulate economic growth. This is why, for example, the CCP has been building ghost cities, these sprawling, massive construction projects where almost nobody lives and few people use. The idea is that the construction of infrastructure helps raise the Chinese GDP, particularly at a time when the Chinese economy has been hit with the CCP virus and by companies pulling the supply chains out of the country. At the same time, Xi Jinping also does apparently view China's current logistics sector as something slowing down development. But realistically, could advancements in transporting goods make much of a difference? Well, we can look at a few factors in this. When it comes to the CCP using infrastructure projects to stay afloat, it has already become overly dependent on this when it comes to artificially inflating its GDP. It has kept up this practice on a massive scale as well. New York Times reported back in 2017, for example, on an Oxford University study that said less than a third of 65 Chinese highway and rail projects that were reviewed were, quote, genuinely economically productive. Again, that means most of them were not economically productive. The rest, it was determined, actually created more debt. The study warned that if the projects weren't reined in, then the poorly managed investment in infrastructure could cause a financial crisis in China. But for the CCP, artificial projects like this have become a key element in the lifeblood of its economic plans. The idea is simple. Each bridge or railroad can cost billions of dollars and create jobs for hundreds of workers for several years. And this is also more than just construction workers. It includes factories, transportation, and other jobs related to the overall project. Again, the entire Chinese infrastructure when it comes to manufacturing. And mega projects like these, which pool their funding from government-issued national debt, are among the key drivers of China's economic growth. Between 2014 and 2019, the CCP spent around $70 billion on ground infrastructure and on projects just to upgrade their air traffic control systems for airports. But in addition to the growing debt and also the long-term issue that these projects end up becoming a debt burden over the course of time, the projects bring along other issues as well, mainly when it comes to government corruption. This is again one of the more serious problems they have. Since the projects usually get their funding from loans by state-owned banks, which in turn go to companies that are typically state-run. This ties directly to local governments that in turn run the businesses and also are in charge of paying back the loans. To pay them back, they often use tolls and other methods. But as a way to make more money for themselves, CCP officials often tack on additional parts for the projects, which bring them in more cash. but also makes the resulting infrastructure overpriced and puts them deeper in debt. And profits from the tolls often then fall short of covering the ongoing costs, let alone paying back the loans themselves. But regardless of these issues, the CCP is showing no signs of stopping with this practice. And even its Belt and Road initiative of constructing infrastructure projects in countries outside of China, often using deceptive debt traps, has also been accused of being little more than an extension of the CCP's practice of using empty and unprofitable construction to inflate its GDP. And now tying this back when it comes to Xi's recent statements on building more for China's logistics sector, this will have little impact when it comes to stopping companies from pulling out of China. Many are pulling out over national security and diplomatic concerns or related issues, and the CCP creating better systems for transportation and storage are not likely to change this. And even more so, it won't be able to fix the nuances of the problems of China's domestic companies and things they're facing right now. For example, the US placing crippling sanctions on Chinese telecom company Huawei that will prevent it from buying chips that are crucial for making its projects. Better airports and transit lines will not help with that. So again, when it comes to the current state of the Chinese economy, if upgrading these logistical systems won't do much to fix the economic issues the CCP is facing, the real issues, then why is Xi Jinping pushing for it, even stating that it should be treated as a critical strategic mission? Well, again, the Chinese economy is in a difficult situation, and the CCP has for more than a decade at least used projects exactly like this to keep its economy running artificially. Very likely again, following the same pattern, this is likely the CCP pushing for the construction of mega projects on a large scale, a massive scale, in order to artificially halt the downward slide of the country's GDP. And there are also a few other key elements to this. The ruling Communist Party's model for economic growth is based on systems of cheating and stealing. We can look, for example, to its use of intellectual property theft, its building of brittle buildings in China, where corners have been cut to save money. These are mockingly called tofu buildings by Chinese netizens. Its use of debt traps against other countries to gain control of infrastructure in these countries. Its use of slave labor, for example, in Xinjiang and elsewhere. And its lack of basic protections that erode any personal motivations for innovation or creativity. So what does this all mean? All of these systems are now being targeted by the West, by the United States very heavily, for example. And this means that all the bricks at the foundation of the CCP's economic programs are being pulled out from under them one by one. In order to save itself, the CCP would need to end these practices and take a legitimate path. But the CCP cannot fundamentally change its nature. It cannot do this without risking the collapse of the CCP itself. And so again, changing the CCP fundamentally, changing the nature of the CCP in order to meet these requirements, would mean ending the CCP and its basic way of operating. It would mean changing the nature of the Communist Party. The problem China faces isn't a broken logistics sector. The problem is the fundamental nature of the Chinese Communist Party.